Live from the Washington DC area, all empowered citizens need to know about intelligent use of resources, smart governance, inclusive communities, smart industry, and healthy, thriving urbanization. This is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. Israel and Palestine is complicated. We're going to talk about the group that has been forgotten, women. Why has there been no outrage about the violence against women in that conflict? Not even from the NGOs who normally cry out about injustice to women first. We're going to hear from an international human rights activist, Tedex speaker, award-winning philanthropist who has supported victims of honor-based violence, cultural and faith abuse, and witchcraft for over 28 years on women, war, and the missing outrage. Our topic tonight. Also coming up, a conversation with multiple rape survivor and 11 times award-winning author who teaches women the lion's roar. Welcome on Smart Sustainability. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Now remember, anything that's truly sustainable is ideology-free. It focuses on life, its power and dynamics, pure and simple. And that's our take on this show. Now first, let's go to Israel, Palestine, or better said, women in conflict. Women are always at the forefront of being punished, used, abused as a piece of meat to take out anger, or use them as war trophies, symbol of conquest, paycheck, retribution, and so much more. Rape during conflict is intended to terrorize a population, break up families, destroy entire communities, and change the ethnic makeup of a generation. It's complete abuse, a perversion of the life-giving power and principle that women actually possess. Now, somehow, warlords have always confused the concept of spirit and matter, it seems, which is why women had to endure rape, slavery, beatings, and murder. Rape as a tactic of war is nothing new. Wars in the early human times, during the Middle Ages, during the World Wars, and the conflicts of the last decades all contained that awful component. After World War II, for example, 2 million German women were raped by Russian soldiers who took their anger out on those women. Girls as young as 4 years old had their vaginas literally cut open with knives just to make room, you know for what. Available data on rape during conflict and its aftermath depicts 250 to 500,000 girls, that's 500,000 we're talking about, that were raped in the genocide in Rwanda, more than 60,000 in Sierra Leone, between 20,000 to 50,000 in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and at least 200,000 in the Democratic Republic of the Congo since 1996, according to the United Nations. Shocking, and most likely seriously underestimated, as many women do not report to authorities what happened to them. It leaves survivors with emotional and psychological trauma, which is then very often passed on to the next generation and lived out in a form of transgenerational trauma. It leaves survivors often with pregnancies, physical injury, HIV, and other sexually transmitted diseases, and social stigma to this very day. The fear of sexual violence during conflict and mass rapes holds entire communities hostage. And in many cases, mass rapes continue after the guns have fallen silent and peace treaties already signed, as was the case in Germany after World War II, for example, and in many conflicts afterwards. The cost and consequences last for generations. It affects men, women, and children, and while systematic rape in conflict today is recognized as crime against humanity and a war crime, it goes mostly unpunished. Sexual violence is routinely neglected in peace negotiations. It's seen as a normal cost of war. In many, actually most, post-conflict countries, violence against women tops the list of crimes, but is rarely investigated properly. It's like taken for granted, a price to be paid. So the attitude, just as with the Israel-Palestine conflict right now. We hear so much outrage on what's happening in Gaza, and rightfully so. But where was the outrage on what happened to the Israeli women and also Palestine women? Where is the outrage in Europe when young girls have been gang raped by an overproportion of perpetrators, being usually of particular countries? Now, this is not to stigmatize anyone, but ignoring facts and looking away doesn't help. We have to call things out. So tonight, we're discussing women, war, and conflict, and where the outrage is, or where it's missing and should be. Joining me first is Mandy Sanghera, international human rights activist, award-winning philanthropist, and global catalyst on women and violence. A Tedex speaker from the UK who's been supporting victims of honor-based violence, cultural abuse, forced marriages, and witchcraft. Thanks so much, Mandy, for coming on.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for kind of setting the scene and talking a little bit about rape being used as a weapon in war. Sadly, there is over 25 conflicts, wars going on in the world, and over 100 conflicts. And sadly, we have seen in the news women from Sudan, from Ethiopia, from all of the countries around the world that have been victims of sexual violence. And more recently, we've seen in Ukraine, women being trafficked, being sexually exploited. And like, obviously, at the end of last year in October, there was a horrific terrorist attack in Israel, and many of the young people that were at a festival have been victims of sexual violence or have been murdered. And for me, I was kind of looking at, where is this feminist? Why is there so much silence? Why have people not spoken out? Because one of the things that I was really shocked by was that actually, and I wrote a blog on the 8th of October, the day after, and I was sort of calling out all my feminists, because I'm in lots of WhatsApp groups and social media groups with lots of different women around the world, and we always talk about gender-based violence, honor-based violence, we talk about abuse and rape and all sorts of different issues. And I was just really shocked and silent, was wondering why people are not speaking out. I was trying to understand the silence. And I actually contacted a lot of these women to say, why are you not speaking out? And everyone kept saying to me, it was like, oh, this is a complicated war. This is a complicated issue. And I said, there's nothing complicated of rape or sexual violence. We need to be clear about protection and not political correctness. There were some people who had made a stance and they made a choice. But for me, as somebody who's campaigned and lobbied and worked on violence against women for over 3 decades, I don't care about your religion, your ethnicity, your gender, whether you're able-bodied or disabled. If you are being abused, I will stand up and support you. So for me, I rescued over 398 people from Afghanistan, and many of the young women have been sexually assaulted and been forced into marriages, and young women were not allowed to leave if you were between the ages of 14 to 45. A lot of the young women were forced to stay behind in Afghanistan. So what I would say to you, as you mentioned, like in Kosovo and all those other areas, we've seen so many women experience rape. In places like India, where women call themselves half widows, they don't know if their husbands are coming back or not. So this is a global issue, and it isn't just immune to the current conflicts of war going on in the Middle East. But I think what I found that was different this time was the silence from the feminists and the campaigners. And I was really saddened to see that people had to create a campaign called Me Too Unless You're a Jew, which I thought was really inappropriate. Like, it shouldn't have been needed, because actually, if you're in the space to support victims, you should have been supporting. I would also say that, what is happening in Gaza right now is not acceptable. It's not good. And I think, a lot of people, are suffering, and and I have spoken up about proportionality, but however, it has been very difficult to watch.
So when you think about Israel and Gaza right now, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
I think when you see the images on the media, it is about, you know, the humanitarian crisis. You are seeing people being displaced. But I also want to let you know that there are people in the south of Gaza, on south of Israel, there on the borders, who have also been displaced. And I think that that isn't always making the news. And we've also seen that, you know, the Hamas terrorists didn't care if you was a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian. They raped and killed a mixture of people. So I think that it's really important that we make that point. I think that one of the reasons why I have been so vocal is that there is still nearly 20 young women been held captive. Now, if we go by the atrocities of October the 7th, only God knows what is going on and how these poor women have been treated. So I think that we need to be looking at talking about peace. It's really important that we are looking at solutions to release the hostages as a matter of urgency. But I also think that we need to be looking at what kind of justice do we get these victims? Are we going to be able to take these women to The Hague to get justice? Are they going to be able to ask, you know, the UN and other organizations to give them justice?
Mandy, let's unpack this here for a moment, step by step. Walk us through, how did you actually get into this in the first place? So you are from the UK. Why do you care so much? How did you get into this?
Okay, I mean, I've been supporting victims and survivors of abuse, as I said, for over 3 decades. I had a friend that had a disability that was forced into a marriage who experienced horrific sexual abuse and physical abuse. I've been brought up as a Sikh and a Hindu, and there was a lot of sort of domestic violence that was going on within my community, and women were not speaking out. So I kind of felt like I had to be a voice for the voiceless and help the helpless and be sort of calling out, you know, abuse. And I think that I fell into this as a very young person, and I've been able to lobby and campaign. I'm one of the founders of the UK Forced Marriage Unit. I've worked with governments around the world to tackle violence against women, look at solutions. And I've always supported victims and migrants, especially in more recent years, in the last 15 years. And we've seen things through the Iraq war, through the first Afghanistan war. We saw, you know, women suffering at the hands of men.
Right. Now, when you've seen so many different conflicts and so many different circumstances of how domestic violence occurred in women. Now, what is different or particularly standing out to you in the Israel-Gaza conflict?
I think as I said earlier, it is about the silence. And I think that sometimes people have not wanting to hear from the survivors. They have not had the media attention. They haven't had the campaigning as other groups may have done. So I think, you know, I don't know if you would recall, but in Nigeria, when Boko Haram took young women and the girls from the school, and we were all campaigning, Michelle Obama and Malala and everybody else, to say, bring them home, bring them home. You know, what I've seen is that it took 50+ days for the UN to make a statement. So the silence from the top was shocking. And I was lobbying and campaigning to say, look, why are we not talking about the sexual violence? Why are we not talking about the atrocities? Why are we not talking about the level of violence against the women? This wasn't just about being raped or even being gang raped. These were horrific atrocities where women have been shot in between the legs and horrific bodies have been burnt and whatever else. So we need to call it out for what it is, because actually this was not just sexual violence, but actually murder of innocent people who were just enjoying a festival, or people were lying at home at night. But what I would say to you, that we have seen this with ISIS, with the Zahidi community in the past. We have seen this, you know, in Sudan more recently, and Ukraine. We have seen women being trafficked. And the problem is that when there is conflict, it is women that are being exploited and being trafficked into the sex industry. And I was involved in supporting nearly 100 Ukrainian women to be safe, to get into safe houses, and to get away from different rings. So for me, this is a real issue. And it isn't just around the current conflict. And I think that even though there is a silence, but one of the things that I would also say to you, a lot of survivors will not speak out. There is a stigma, there is a shame, there is something that even from my own community, there's so much around virginity and all these sort of issues that sometimes that we probably take for granted in the West. And we have to understand that, you know, when you are a victim of sexual violence or any kind of assault, even if your family say it's okay and, you know, but you with that trauma and that would not be able to probably have a relationship in the same way ever again. So I think that, you know, the psychological, the emotional abuse on somebody is far more, you know, impactful than probably even the rape itself. I'm not saying that that is okay, but I think what we need to do now is talk about these issues openly. Yeah, and I think we need to be looking at what do we do when this conflict hopefully will end really soon, but we don't know how long it's going to take. And we need to be looking at what kind of psychological support is available for all victims, and even the people in Gaza as well, because there are innocent people who are also being abused by the terrorists. This is not just about Israel, because we need to look at, there are women that who are being exploited and being sexually exploited within Gaza as well. So I think that, you know, this is not about religion, about Israel. Like I said to you, this is also about, you know, Muslim women.
Now,
Christian
you mentioned
women.
to me when we spoke that the violence in Israel seemed to have been worse to you than what you've encountered before.
Yes, because I think that in the past, when we look at Rwanda, the Congo, when we look at other countries where you'll get raped and maybe 2 or 3 men or even more could, you know, I'm not saying that that is, but this is about the using physical abuse on top of the sexual abuse is something that has been somewhat different. This was about sending fear into Israel. I think that there's, you know, I mean, you have to question what the heck these guys were on, to be honest with you, to be able to carry out such atrocities.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think that really is the key essence. What do you think is the role of violence? Why are we actually always dealing with that? Is it because it's an attack on women life-giving power? Is it a misconception in many of those nations of really the difference between spirit and matter, where you have many societies that somehow think that spirit means kind of they dictate the tone, and matter, women are matter in terms of a piece of earth, so to speak, instead of understanding different aspects to it. But let's unpack this here for a moment. What's your take on that? Where is it actually coming from? The origin, the root?
So I think, you know, violence against women is sadly been a real issue, and it's 1 in 3 women will experience violence in her lifetime. And so sometimes, you know, we have seen this even in the streets of London, in America, and there is gang warfare. And actually, sometimes to take revenge on somebody, we would dishonor their families, we would rape their sister or their mother. So I think, you know what, this isn't just about conflict. This can be in the streets of the UK, in America, or anywhere in any city. So there has been issues where even in places in India, sometimes people may want to seek justice, what they feel as justice, to take revenge, or they have, you know, other issues that they want to address. And sadly, by targeting your woman or your daughter or your mother, by that shame, that stigma, is something that, you know, will motivate people, and we need to say it as it is. And I think it's really important that, you know, we don't sugarcoat the truth here.
Now you mentioned the most shocking part to you was the silence. Let's talk there for a moment. Do you think there is actually like an order to things in what we prioritize more. So I have a feeling that in Gaza, as you mentioned, many people don't want to get into that because it's a very complicated issue, and it would somehow require you to stand up for, let's say, women are more important than, for example, other conflicts that are going on there right now. And I feel that women always get kind of like the sideline, like we're sort of the afterthought, really, whereas it's really a very central conflict to life and peace and also harmony in societies. So if you had these things, for example, happen in other with other races or other demographics, do you think there would have been more of an outcry about this?
I mean, like I said, that there has been a silence, and I think that that is now public, where people like myself have publicly called out the UN Women, and I think that you have seen people like Sheryl Sandberg and different people like Gloria Steinem and Phyllis Chesler openly speaking out, calling out people to say, why are you silent? And it's a really difficult one, because actually, sometimes what will happen is people will be interested in the news for a day or two, but actually sometimes they'll just move on to the next story. But sadly, the people who are living in Israel and Gaza can't switch off. We're over 100 days into this conflict to date. And, we need to be looking at the victims. There are people still held hostage. And we need to be asking to be negotiating with peace to try and bring these people home safely. We need the children to be returned immediately. And the thing is, we need to be talking to the Middle East and other countries about, going back to the negotiation table to make sure that, this doesn't ever happen again. And as much, it's very, very difficult. And I think that even if I would talk to some of my feminist friends and colleagues, they have made a choice because they have seen, they're seeing children being murdered. And that breaks my heart. And when we see, things that are being bombed, which is very upsetting because, innocent people are dying. And sadly, Hamas has continued to use the Palestinian people as, human shields for years and years. And, and we need to question that all the aid that has gone into there and sadly has gone into the pockets, and the people there have become richer, and the poor Palestinian continue to be starving and not even have the basic amenities. So I think, this is a really complicated issue. And this is, for me, about humanity. And, people are sort of questioning, what does this look like? What does the end of this war look like? I mean, that seems so far away, but I hope that the victims of abuse will get some sort of support and be able to move on with their lives. But I also believe that, how do you build back after all this conflict? What does that look like? And, we need to be working and educating children and not spreading hate. So there is a lot of work to be done. A friend of mine was killed, called Vivian Silver, who actually did a lot of work on peace and worked with people in Gaza and Israel to look at peace. And we need people like that, again, to try to look at supporting all victims and citizens of Israel and Gaza. And I think it is a really complicated issue.
So where do you see the role of women go into all of this, for example?
So we need more women at the decision-making table. We need women to be involved.
But women are also the ones who turn away. So we hear it in the news, and then many women in the West, they forget about it after 2 days, after 3 days.
So I think,
because we think it's so far away.
But the thing is, we need to lobby. So, I mean, I'm going to the UN. There is the US conference on status of women now, CSW, in March, and there is other conferences happening. And it's really important that we continue to have these conversations. I've just come back from Davos yesterday, and we had this very particular conversation. We heard from victims. We heard from people from Ukraine. We heard from people, there was a conference on trafficking, real cost of that, where people are being sold, children are being sold. So I think that, there is no winners in this war. And as women, as campaigners, we have to unite, because actually, like I always say, this shall pass. This will come through the other side, like the Me Too movement. Nobody's really talking about that anymore. Nobody's really talking about the Black Lives Matters. But, this shouldn't be just trends. I think that we need to make sure that if you are a victim of abuse or sexual violence, that you have access to the right support and services, that actually we are able to call it out for what it is.
But isn't it sometimes also women that turn away because they don't want to hear it, because they feel, other women, that they don't want to hear about it because it makes them feel uncomfortable? Isn't it also sometimes women that kind of actually have like a two-class system and differentiate between those that has happened to and those who are not? I've experienced that.
Okay, well, the thing is, you know what, we have to stand up. And like I said to you at the beginning when I spoke, for me, and I can only speak for me, I will stand up and support all victims, regardless of race and ethnicity. I mean, it's like when I've traveled to India and we have a whole class system and people will say to me, oh, well, oh, she was a Dalit, it doesn't matter about her. Well, it does matter, because actually, she is still a human being. She has a right to be treated with respect and dignity. But, we shouldn't be telling women to stay safe. We need to be educating men about respect. We need to be teaching men about, sexual violence is not okay, not in the home. It's not okay in the workplace. It's not okay in war and conflict. So we need to educate boys.
Yeah, and that actually also goes back, exactly, that actually goes back to the very upbringing of boys. I know there is actually in South Africa, there's a particular initiative of women that help other women, particularly single mothers, to educate boys in a way that they basically come up and they grow up with respect for their mothers and also understanding the impact of violence. So this kind of stuff I think we would need more of, because we sometimes forget about that. And it seems that very often when you look at these really big brutes that take it out on women, if you really dig deep, many of them have a very conflicted relationship with their mothers.
I mean, look, there's a lot of work to be done around violence. We need to educate men. We need to work with the communities. We cannot do this on our own. We have a moral responsibility to call out abuse and all forms of abuse. And, we're looking at this in the Taliban, girls are not allowed to go to school. And, people are becoming depressed, children are being forced and being sold, so we need to be looking at speaking out, because it's not okay for a parent to sell their 5, 6-year-old or 9-year-old daughter and to a man that's like 3 times her age or 4 times older than her father, just to survive. So I think, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So when we think about conflict, I would say that we don't just look at the current one, because there are some that have been ongoing for many years, and that we look at trying to educate, that I would ask that all the feminists around the world unite, and we support everyone regardless of their religion, ethnicity, culture, gender, whatever. It's really important. I also would say that we have women at the peacemaking decision tables. And I also think we need to smash the shame around stigma around rape, because actually there is nothing honorable about abuse. So those would be my takeaways with you today.
And last question, before we end this. So very often in peace negotiations so far, actually, violence against women, even during war crimes, have always taken sort of a second seat. How would we change that? What do you think needs to happen? I mean, yes, we heard women have to stand up, more women on the decision making table, but what is also, like, in practical terms, legally, if you can think of something, what do you think is the most important to actually make this an issue of the negotiation, of the peace negotiations, and put it on the table?
So I think there's a couple of things. I think there is a thing about we can't victim blaming. There's been sort of so much fake news to say that actually all things have been imaged, been AI and all this nonsense. You know what? One thing that I have learned in my over 3 decades of working with survivors, that only once in my whole career of supporting hundreds of victims of either child marriage, sexual abuse, only one person kind of lied about somebody. And so when a survivor tells me that they've been raped, I believe them. So that is the first thing that I would say to you. And when we're having decisions at the table, we're looking at what does the future look like. We need to look at offering justice, that people get that justice. They can access the right support services and counseling and talking therapies and whatever else is there. So this is not just about like, okay, do you know what, we've now, the war's ended, we're going to go back, we're going to build, because actually sometimes it could take people years to come back and talk about the trauma and the abuse that they have experienced. So I think that, you know, we need to also look at supporting families. We also need to educate the men, because sometimes what will happen is once you've been raped or been in, you know, sometimes people will say, oh, I don't want to be with you anymore. And actually people lose their homes, their families, their relationships. So we need to be doing some work around this. So there is, you know, I've seen this in, you know, the global south, in Africa and other countries where, oh, well, you know, oh my God, you know, you're not good enough anymore, you're soiled, you're damaged, or whatever else. People will use awful language. We need to take away that. And I think that we need to really work hard to address these issues.
All right. Thank you so much, Mandy, for coming on. That was Mandy Sanghera, international human activist. Thank you for your insights. And now I want to go to South Africa and talk to Lynn Hill, 11 times award-winning author, survivor of multiple rapes, who teaches women to roar like a lion. And a lion she is, as you're about to find out.
In the beginning of one of your books, you write, it takes as much effort to dig a grave than it takes to plant a seed. And that really got me, because when you think about this, there is so much stigma attached with it, and there's so much pain attached with it. But there's also this huge potential of hope that goes with that. So I really want to use that time today and talk a little bit how we transition from those really terrible things, from digging the grave. And I think it's fair to say that many people who experience violence, femicide, murder, or anything like this are in some degree also, it's not just the grave of the person who's been murdered, who we actually cry about, but it's also you die somewhere within.
Born in 1967, born into the height of apartheid in South Africa, experiencing the consequences of that at about the age of 7 or 8, being forcibly moved from just under Table Mountain, which is one of the most scenic beauties of our city, to the outskirts of where there were no roads, where tadpoles swam in their pools in mud, and that was supposed to be a road to transitioning from school, and then the life-changing event beyond that, beyond running from rubber bullets and riots in 1976 as an 8-year-old, to then being very brutally raped at the age of 15. And beyond that specific life-changing event, beyond coming to face with death as a result of the brutalization. You know, it was considered to be one of the most brutal rapes that the police had seen. I was the first woman of color to speak my truth as a 16-year-old in my school uniform in the High Court of Cape Town, because at that time, the violation of women of color, sexual violation of women of color, was not that big a deal. And so I guess that marked a further trajectory of a thematic in my life, which exists until today as a speaker, as an advocate for the redefinition of power and gender wellness in this world. It marked the beginning of the thematic, which was speaking on behalf of the voiceless. I fell pregnant at 19. Beyond that, yes, he was convicted as well, very unfairly so. The legal system was not on my side, sadly. 41 years
when you
later,
say
it
the
is still
legal,
not on anyone's side. Sorry?
so when you say the legal system was not on your side, that was still because it was not deemed, I mean, this was still during the height of the apartheid, right? So this was
Yeah,
not
but
deemed...
and what I'm now saying, Nicolette, is that it's 41 years later, and the legal system is still embedded in patriarchy. So, as a woman of color, I was born into two limiting ideologies. The one was apartheid, and the one was patriarchy. Patriarchy has not changed. Apartheid, constitutionally, quote unquote, has changed. But as a woman of color, I still experience counter racism. So, constitutionally, yes. Practically, realistically, for me, truly, economically, not much has changed. Patriarchy still exists. There's still bail for rapists in our country. He came out on a 500 Rand bail 41 years ago. Bail, on average, has increased for rapists in 41 years by 300 to 500 Rand. And we ask ourselves, why is it that we are the rape capital of South Africa? Beyond 15, beyond all of that, I fell pregnant at 19, stepped into a 17-year marriage from about the age of 20, completed all of my studies full-time and part-time.
A marriage of your choosing, or a marriage of that was not of your choosing?
If I look at what my level of woundedness was, and if I look at what my level of self-worth was as a result of that woundedness, then it was not the most psychologically and spiritually mature decision to make. And sometimes our decisions and the quality of our decisions get tainted by the lenses through which we view the world.
Absolutely. But this is
our world.
But this is a personal thing, right? So what I was getting to is you made the choice based on who you were at the time to marry and go forward. But just for our understanding, so that our viewers also understand, I want to go back a little bit to when you were 15. So when you were 15 and you experienced this brutal rape, was this within the community you were living, or was this outside the community? And was this among your own people, or was this among also racially motivated? Was this where did this happen? And what was the conducive element to that?
So it was within my community. It was a fellow, if one wants to call it, a fellow colored man, a person of color. I did not know him, but he happened to belong to my church. And I happened to, by default, be in the same private space that he was in, by total default. Allegedly, I was not the first woman he raped. And I think for me, that was knowing that, hearing that when I came out of a 72-hour sedation was, I think, the initiation of a conviction within myself that if I was not the first, and remember, I was only about 15 and a half at this time, and it was a matter of 72 hours later, hearing this as I came out of sedation, if I was not the first, that was okay. But as a 15-year-old, 15 and a half, I would make sure within my control that I would be the last. And I think it was that moment, just organic, no insight into social justice, not knowing what it was going to cost me psychologically to defend myself against a patriarchal system, against a legal system that did not protect victims. Secondary victimization is another form of violation. And just organically, it was, I will lay the charge. I will do this because there is no other option.
Mm.
And so that's what I did.
Mm-hmm. Now let's move forward, go back to you got married, and then what happened then afterwards? Just to get a little bit understanding in terms of who's Lynn.
I got married. You asked me why. And I think if in retrospect, if I look back now, I thought I loved him with all of my heart. But I think the underlying propelling force to marry was one of moral principle. Whereas the rape victim, I had already been judged because women are judged when they are raped. Part of patriarchy. So I'd been judged, and here I was only 4 years later, afraid of being judged again, and afraid of what I did was, by falling pregnant outside of marriage from a societal perspective, I was almost evidencing the belief that I was raped because I was easy. And I think at an unconscious level, to counter that mystification, and also, I guess, to defend my sense of moral self and my sense of who Lynn really was, and she was a principled woman, I did what I was expected to do through the lenses of woundedness and pain and diminishment, and brutally honest with myself. I wasn't feeling worthy. I wasn't even feeling worthy of making the greatest decisions in terms of my own self-interest. I was making it on what I thought society was expecting of me and how I would need to do this in order to neutralize society's judgment. And so that's what I did. Went on, studied full-time, studied part-time, chose to do psychology as a result of having gone through my own trauma, having been in psychotherapy. I was very blessed to be able to do that, because women of my color traditionally and up till today, once again, cannot access psychotherapy because of the cost attached to it. I was very blessed to have been able to do that. But sitting there and having a clinical psychologist, an intern, look at you every Friday afternoon and say, for 1 year, in post-traumatic stress disorder, 1 year after the rape, I know what you must be going through. And when she used to say that, I wanted to shout and I wanted to scream. And there were moments when I shut down, because the only person who would ever know what you are going through when it comes to
is the
sexual
person
brutalization and sexual trauma.
Yeah.
That doesn't come from a framework in a psychology textbook to say that this is empathy. The only person who would know that, I did my psychology degree. I majored in English and psych while I had my baby girl, who I chose to have. And that wasn't just a decision for society. That was something I owed her, having been told after I was raped that I'd never be able to bear children. and then contemplating abortion for about 3 days because I'd won 3 scholarships. And had the world not known, and remember those 3 scholarships would almost be my statement of validation, because that was still a phase of my life where the only validation I felt I owned was intellectual. And I used my intellectuality and my intelligence as a way of worthiness, because I pushed, and I pushed hard, and yes, it was deflection and repression and denial and all of the psych mechanisms that I didn't even know names of. But the one thing I held onto was conscientiousness. The one thing I held onto was you could violate my body, you could destroy my soul, because it was a soul destroying episode. The police thought a train had ridden over my face. It wasn't 45 minutes of rape. It was 45 minutes of sexual brutalization and torture, where at the end of the 45 minutes, every hole in my body bled. My eyes, my ears, my nose, my mouth, every hole in my body, and I drowned in my own blood, and I smelt my blood. So you could do all of that to me, but you were not going to touch my dreams.
Your count from the first one, which you from when you were 15, when you said you drowned in your own blood, and it took a lot of healing to get to the second one, where I presume at that point, which just was 5 years ago, so you had done a lot of work, you overcame it, etc. Well, you were drugged, so you probably don't remember, but when you became conscious of what had happened the second time, what was that first reaction or the first thought that you had? Given that the first one was so brutal and long ago, but it was still sort of there. What was that? What was the first thing that came to your mind?
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God, it happened again. My body this time, my physiology rejected the trauma. So as much as I was rationalizing and in a moment of just shock and how and why, and that was a very limited period, because my body went into involuntary shock, and I couldn't argue my body. I couldn't rationalize 29 days of shock. I couldn't fly back to Cape Town because of my blood pressure and my irregular heart rate. That evil never attacks evil. That evil attacks purity in order to define itself. And that made me judge myself less, because I was worthy of judging myself less.
Yeah. If you had to describe Lynn Hill as a young woman, how would you describe who was Lynn Hill as a younger woman? Like, give me like 3 adjectives. How would you describe yourself then? As a person, as who you thought of yourself, how would you describe yourself?
Highly confident, highly intelligent, and absolutely passionate about the arts.
And how would you describe Lynn Hill today? Who is that person, that personality today?
The beauty of what you're asking me now, and no interviewer has ever done this and unleashed it within myself, is I would actually say highly passionate, highly creative, and highly intelligent. And the fact that obviously relentless, doggedly so in pursuit of purpose and passion. But the fact that I'm able to take and respond with the same three adjectives for me in this moment, and I said no one's unleashed this within me before, the fact that I can be who I am at 56 and who I was at 15, the fact that that intrinsic attributes still exist, never mind what has happened in between, bears testimony to my level of authenticity and what I bring to the world as the same Lynn now, 41 years later, which testifies to healing and wholeness and restoration and embodying the very things I inspire and teach in this world.
People would probably change some of the adjectives, but that brings us back to something I want to go a little deeper. And this is the core essence. And this was actually the beautiful lead into that. So when you look back and you saw there was this young woman who had all these adjectives, and there's the more mature woman who has the same adjectives, probably a more colorful and a little richer and more passionate in how you said that. But that brings something out that I think is the core essence. And I want to get back to something, because when women go through, or a woman goes through experiencing violence, sexual violence, physical violence, any other form of violence, I don't even want to exclude a form of violence, because they all perceived very independent, very, you know, at different strengths, but they all perceived by a woman who goes through at different levels. But what happens, I think, is that as traumatic as a moment like this is, it kind of strips everything off of you to the very core. And the very core remains and gets stronger, right?
Absolutely. All I had in my organic responses as a 15-year-old was the core. And even just writing my book and rereading what I had written on my forgiveness chapter, which obviously contextualizes forgiveness in relation to what I needed to forgive. If I look back now, then my core was courage, and my core remained the will to dream in the heart of apartheid, in the heart of a justice system that didn't serve me. Just, I refused diminishment in a state of non-pity, in a state of non-victimization, just in a state of honor of what she had overcome, of how she chose to overcome without prompting, legal prompting from her parents. All of these decisions were mine. And it was phasal. But the one thing when I wrote the article I realized was that I never waited for the grave to disappear. I never waited for my fear to disappear, Nicolette. I never waited for my pain to disappear. In fact, holding on to my dreams became the healing balm.
Do you think that is an inherent strength of yourself? Because I detect a lot of fire when I think about, you know, the elements in a person. And everyone has a different disposition in terms of what element they live out more prevalently. So I detect a lot of will, a lot of power in terms of fire, the passion, the fire, the will to live, that drive, and the pride. Is this, though, some of your inherent characteristics? Or is this something that I'm sure you developed it over time, but it seemed to be that's also something that was an inherent characteristic. Whereas there might be some people where the will or the willpower might not be as strongly alive in that person. Have you encountered other people where there was a slightly different approach and it took them longer, or they had to work a little harder? Or is that one of the reasons why they were just waiting for the grave to disappear? And you did not.
I didn't. I think we all have different intrinsic dispositions.
Mm-hmm.
And as a counselor, and I am a qualified counselor, and that has been one of the purpose-serving stuff of the pain, was I vowed when I sat there and they said, I know what you're going through. I vowed then to become a counselor with intentionality, especially when it came to trauma, to be able to self-disclose in those moments and say, I do know, because is one of the most liberating moments for the individual that you're sitting opposite. So I became a counselor, and yes, everyone responds to trauma differently. The one thing, however, is my reminding victims of trauma that never mind what we have gone through, never mind what our personality is, never mind where our courage levels and assertiveness levels lie, our levels of self-awareness. It doesn't take any of those things to make a simple choice to say that I will not allow a violation to violate my identity in such a way that it will dilute my destiny. Because the moment we succumb to that, we are giving the violator a lifelong control and power over us. So what is meant to be an event, well, with child molestation, it's not a once-off, it's a process.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes a choice. The will to heal is a choice. The will to know why you want to heal propels that choice to a greater level of commitment. When you know, commitment to the will to heal, commitment to still become, because you know who you were meant and born to be. The knowing of who I was born to be was not because of the fire inside of me. It was simply because of just knowing that I was never meant to wear the identity of, first of all, a colored woman. Secondly, one who was raped. Thirdly, one who had been abused in a marriage. Those are labels.
Mm.
And our intrinsic divine identity, we were not born labeled. We given labels. And reclaiming the queendom was simply stepping into an innate state of queen before she was scripted. And we are all royalty because we carry the divinity of our divine creator. It's the scripting that leads to diminishment. And I had to come to terms with social scripting prior to the rape, post the rape, as a woman, a married woman, and then, of course, as a divorcee, and then, of course, and all of that has the background of a social script.
And that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for watching. I know this is still a huge issue. Violence against women, we are still being used so often as fodder for wars, and really for basically being used as the payout for all the pain that has happened in there. But in any case, the women in the world have to come together, also the men in this world, so we actually end that, because this does not get us any closer to a sustainable tomorrow. On that note, have a wonderful evening and a good night.